In the annals of British kit car history, there are vehicles that captured imaginations, and then there are vehicles that were born from hieroglyphics scratched into a recording studio wall during a rather enthusiastic evening in 1988. This is the story of the Hollier Mosquito, and I can assure you it's far stranger than you might imagine. Section 1. The night the mosquito was conceived. Picture this, if you will, South Ruislip, Middlesex, late 1988. A DIY recording studio tucked away behind someone's house, and a conversation about triangulation. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm having a late-night conversation with friends, we're generally not discussing the fundamental principles of structural engineering. But Chris Hollier wasn't like most people. He was trying to explain to a non-mechanical friend how forces should feed upward toward the apex of a triangle in an ideal structure. And because words apparently weren't sufficient, he began scratching his theories directly onto the studio walls. Permanently, like some sort of automotive Da Vinci, creating his own Sistine Chapel of chassis design. The following morning, and I want you to appreciate the word following here, when sobriety and daylight returned, Chris looked at those indelible gouges in the wall and realized something remarkable. Those ancient hieroglyphics, as he would later call them, formed the perfect basis for a lightweight sports car chassis. Most people would see vandalism. Chris Hollier saw the future. And that's where our story truly begins. Section 2. The Mini, Britain's perfect donor. Now, to understand what makes the Mosquito so clever, we need to talk about Alec Isagonis and his remarkable packaging achievement, the original Mini. The Mini wasn't just a car, it was a masterpiece of compact engineering. Isagonis had mounted the engine, transmission, suspension and steering all on a single fabricated steel subframe. This brilliant design meant that on the assembly line, you could essentially bolt an entire corner of the car into place as one unit. But here's the beautiful thing, and this is what Chris Hollier understood. When the Mini's body inevitably rusted away and failed its MOT, that subframe could be removed, extracted, liberated from its automotive prison and given new life. And Chris had an idea. What if you collected two front subframes, one with its engine intact but with the steering locked, and mounted it mid-engine style just behind the driver, while the second front subframe, without the engine, is located up front for steering. Section 3. Building in a garden shed. Early 1989, a small workshop behind Chris Hollier's house in South Ruislip. This wasn't some gleaming facility with CNC machines and carbon fibre autoclaves. This was a shed with two long-time friends, Laurie Bush and Tony Frost. The design methodology was, let's call it organic. Chris and his friends set two mini front subframes on the workshop floor, positioned two medium-sized adults between them sitting on wooden boxes, and essentially designed the chassis dimensions around real human beings in real space. No computers, no CAD software, just workshop floors, wooden boxes, and common sense. The chassis itself was formed using a plumber's pipe bender. The same tool you'd use to run copper piping around your house was now creating the backbone of a mid-engine sports car. And then came the power. A 1275 cubic centimetre mini Clubman engine was stripped and sent out for a proper rebuild. High compression pistons, Kent Stage 2 camshaft, big valve cylinder head, a 45 DCOE Weber carburettor on a swan neck manifold, custom chrome big bore exhaust. When it was all said and done, they had 85 brake horsepower at the rear wheels. Now, that might not sound like much in today's world of 500 horsepower SUVs, but remember, this thing probably weighed less than your garden furniture. Section 4. Uxbridge and the birth of a kit car. Late summer 1989, the Uxbridge Auto Show. The Mosquito prototype was finished and put on display, painted yellow and red, raw, exposed, utterly honest about what it was, and it caught the attention of Peter Philby, editor of Which Kit magazine. Now here's where it gets interesting. Philby sent a very young Ian Stent, who had just joined the magazine as a junior reporter to review the car. This was essentially Stent's baptism by fire, or rather, baptism by exposed tubular chassis with minimal bodywork and 85 horsepower trying to spin the wheels. Ian Stent was, understandably, nervous. The Mosquito had very little in the way of creature comforts, or comforts of any type, really. But he drove it anyway, and he wrote a 5-page article that launched the Mosquito into the public consciousness. That article was the starting gun. The prototype had proven itself. Now it was time to see if anyone would actually pay money for one. Section 5. Castle Combe, where the chassis proved itself. But before we could start taking orders, Chris needed to know something crucial. Would the chassis actually survive being driven properly? Late 1989, Castle Combe racetrack in Wiltshire, a kit car action day. The perfect opportunity to find out where the limits were. The first few tentative laps revealed that the rear suspension tracking needed adjustment. The front springs were diving under braking. Chris returned to the pits, made quick adjustments, and went back out. Over the course of the day, Chris completed about 50 laps, and the final few laps, flat out. Absolutely flat out. Pushing it to find where the chassis would fail, where the design would show its weaknesses. And here's the remarkable thing. The limiting factor wasn't the chassis. It wasn't the mechanical components. It was, and I'm quoting directly here, lack of talent by the driver. The chassis was sound. The design worked. The Mosquito could handle. Many people at Castle Combe were genuinely surprised by how quick the car was and how little needed to change to get it performing properly. And that's when the serious inquiries started coming in. The Mosquito wasn't just a workshop experiment anymore, it was a product. Section 6. Mr. Whippy Pink and Stoneleigh. Now, there was one problem. Everyone agreed the chassis was brilliant. Everyone agreed it was fun to drive. But the styling. The trailer-style mudguards. The front body panel that looked like it had been borrowed from a particularly optimistic tractor. Late 1989, early 1990, Chris made a decision. New fiberglass panels, proper wings, a nose cone, and crucially, seats that would actually fit someone taller than 5 feet 8 inches. The original prototype was stripped and prepared for its debut at Stoneleigh Kit Car Show in May 1990. And this is where Chris made a choice that was either genius or madness, depending on your perspective. He painted the car bright pink. Not just any pink, Mr. Whippy bright pink. The exact shade used on ice cream vans. A colour so lurid, so aggressively attention-seeking, that you couldn't possibly ignore it. He added a pink-wrapped steering wheel, a pink gear lever, and I want you to appreciate this detail, plastic frame sunglasses that matched. The show organisers hadn't received a booking for an exhibition stand, but when Chris arrived, they offered him a spot immediately inside the main door. The first thing showgoers saw when they entered was a visual blast of Mr. Whippy Pink. Chris had printed information leaflets and price lists. They were gone by the end of day 1. He had to hurry to the organiser's office to photocopy more for day 2. The pink Mosquito was an absolute sensation. Production begins. Bull bars and MIG welders. The exposure at Stoneleigh confirmed it. There was genuine interest. Real deposits started coming in. The first full kit was ordered within a week. 2 more orders came from Newark Kit Car Festival in June. But Chris quickly realised he had a problem. Using a plumber's pipe bender to form chassis rails was taking far too long and wasn't providing the accuracy needed for production vehicles. The solution? A company that manufactured bull bars for camper vans. They had CNC-controlled tube bending machinery. Chris ordered 6 sets of chassis rails. They were completed within 2 weeks. And Chris made another crucial change, switching from stick arc welding to MIG welding. Stronger chassis, neater joints, professional quality. Fiberglass laminating was initially done in a corner of the workshop, but the influx of chassis rails and the demands of the regular day job, car servicing and repair, made this impossible. Chris tried outsourcing to a laminating company in Buckinghamshire. The results were rejected. Another supplier was found closer to home, but the cost was prohibitive. Only 3 more sets of body panels were made. Production was happening, but it was complicated. Section 9. The competition, or lack thereof. In the early 1990s, the Mosquito wasn't exactly fighting in a crowded marketplace. There was UVA's Fugitive, which used VW Beetle running gear. But the Fugitive had a fatal flaw. All the engine mass was behind the rear axle, making the front end light and causing terrible understeer above 50 miles per hour. Beach buggies were popular, but the aging VW technology was becoming off-putting. Lotus 7-style roadsters and AC Cobra replicas dominated the kit car market. Shortly after Mosquito production ceased, NCF made the Blitz, very similar concept, slightly smaller, with a bullnose. They sold quite a few. But mid-engined cars using mini components? There were others, but most were enclosed and suffered from terrible gear change issues because the standard mini layout put the gear lever behind the engine. The Mosquito used a clever drop-link system that allowed the original mini gear change to work perfectly in the new configuration. And then, in 1995, MG launched something that changed everything, the MGF. Section 10. The MGF, what the Mosquito dreamed of being. The MGF was, in many ways, what the Mosquito had hoped to become: lightweight, mid-engined, 2-seater sports car. Using parts from the British Leyland parts bin, rearranged into something exciting. It had a multi-million-pound development budget, 2 engine options, a 1.6-litre producing 115 horsepower and a 1.8 VVC, variable valve timing, producing 150 horsepower at 6,500 RPM. Initial sales were excellent, and then the rumours started. Head gasket failures, catastrophic cooling system issues. In hindsight, it appears MG had positioned the thermostat too far from the engine. When it opened, it flooded the engine with cold water, causing the aluminium head to distort and fail the head gasket. Rather than recall and fix the problem, MG stuck their corporate heads in the sand. The damage to the brand was terminal. When MG launched the TF in 2002 with a fixed cooling system, the damage was already done. Sales never recovered. Fast forward to 2019. MGFs are rusting away. Sound familiar? And the resale values are so poor that many are towed away for free just to clear space. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Section 11. Chassis number 5. A life well lived. Remember chassis number 5? Kermit Green, fitted with gull-wing doors made from steel section and perspex. Originally sold to Vic Drake. After Vic got the chassis painted and partially built, Chris finished it. The car passed through several owners and ended up with Matthew Smudger Smith, who used it as a daily driver and rebuilt the engine multiple times. In early 2019, following a relationship breakup and loss of storage space, Smudger put the car up for sale on Facebook. After offering advice on resale values and hearing it might be scrapped, Chris made a decision. He bought it back. To save at least one example of this minuscule part of British motoring history. The car was in remarkably good shape, original features intact, including the gull-wing doors, but Chris wasn't content to just preserve it as a museum piece. This was a car that was meant to be driven, hard. And that's exactly what's happening today. Chassis number 5 is now with Lee Peck, who's been using it regularly for auto tests with his 16-year-old daughter. Imagine that. A car conceived in 1988, built in 1989, passing through multiple owners, nearly scrapped, rescued, and now teaching a teenager the art of precision driving. That's not preservation, that's legacy. Section 12. Chassis number 10. But there's another chapter in this story that we haven't fully explored yet. Remember chassis number 10? The one I mentioned earlier that was VW Golf based? wider, longer, with fabricated wishbones all around and aluminium body panels. That car was built for Andy Jones with a 1.6 Golf GTI engine. And after Andy, it passed to a new owner in 2006, who got it running again. But the story doesn't end there. Enter Alan Lawrence. Not the astronaut who walked on the moon, though given what he's accomplished with this car, the comparison might not be entirely unfair. Alan acquired chassis number 10 and has done, well, let's just say he's done all the good stuff. Extensive work, refinements, improvements, the kind of dedication that comes from genuinely understanding what makes these cars special. And here's what makes this interesting. Alan represents something crucial to the Mosquito story. He's not just a custodian of automotive history, he's a builder. Someone who took Chris's original vision and evolved it, adapted it, made it his own while respecting the fundamental principles that made it work in the first place. Chris created the design, but builders like Alan proved that the design could be taken further, adapted to different power plants, refined through real-world use and experimentation. Chassis number 10 isn't just a car. It's proof that the Mosquito concept had room to grow, to adapt, to become something more than even Chris originally imagined. Section 13. 2 perspectives, 1 legacy. And that brings us to where we are today. 30 plus years after hieroglyphics were scratched onto a recording studio wall. After 11 chassis were built in a garden shed. After Mr. Whippy Pink shocked Stoneleigh showgoers. After cars scattered across the UK, some thriving, some lost to history. Chassis number 5 is alive and well, teaching a teenager the art of auto test driving. Chassis number 10 has been refined and perfected, but there are still so many questions. What were the real challenges Chris faced during those early production days? What secrets lie in the technical details that never made it into magazine articles? What has Alan discovered through his extensive work on Chassis 10? How do you take a basic concept and evolve it into something that works even better? And perhaps most intriguingly, what happens when the designer and the builder sit down together? When the man who created the original vision meets the man who proved that vision could be pushed further? Chris Hollier himself is going to walk us through the complete story, the successes, the failures, the near disasters, and the moments of pure engineering brilliance that only happen when you're working in a garden shed with a pipe bender and a vision. Joining him is Alan Lawrence, the builder and owner of chassis number 10, who's going to reveal all the good stuff he's done, the modifications, the improvements, the lessons learned from actually driving and maintaining one of these remarkable machines. Together they represent 2 sides of the Mosquito story, the visionary who created it and the enthusiast who proved it could be even better. They're going to reveal things that even the most dedicated kit car historians don't know. Photos you've never seen, technical details that never made it into Which Kit magazine, and insights that only come from decades of living with these cars.